Hello there. If you're interested in telling women's stories from history and a fan of Professor Suzannah Lipscomb, then stay tuned.
Welcome to Fridays Live.
Hello there. Welcome to today's very special edition of Findmypast Live with special guest Professor Suzannah Lipscomb, who will be joining us very, very shortly. My name is Staveley-Wadham and I am Findmypast's newspaper licensing manager. So please do say hello in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from today. A big welcome to those tuning in from the Women's Prize and also Suzannah's channels. It's lovely to have you here today, and welcome to those also watching on catch up. So whether you're new here or a regular, please do join in the conversation with us. And we've got our lovely social media manager, Ellie, in the comments today. So please do say hello. So before introducing Suzannah, I know you're all waiting for. Here's a little preview of today's very special session. So we're going to be talking to Suzannah about the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, the importance of bringing women from history's stories to life, researching and writing women's stories, and much more besides. It's going to be a packed session. We're also going to be taking a look at some of our new records of the week here at Findmypast and answering our question of the week. And our question of the week this week is very appropriate. It's very on theme. It is, which female ancestor would you most like to meet and why? I'll say that again. Which female ancestor would you most like to meet and why? So we'll be coming back to that one later on, but please do start popping your answers in the comments, and I'm sure Ellie will note down that question there for us. And there will be a chance to ask Suzannah some questions as well towards the end, but please do feel free to share your questions for Suzannah as we go along. So I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Suzannah Lipscomb today. Welcome, Suzannah. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Rose. How are you today?
Oh, I'm just so delighted to have you here, and I'm sure our audience doesn't need an introduction to you, but just in case they did, Suzannah, you are an award-winning author, historian and broadcaster. You've written many books and appeared across television series, ITV, on the BBC and more. You are the host of our podcast, Step Into the Past, and this year you are the chair of the judges for the inaugural prize. I'm so excited. The inaugural prize I'm skipping over my words. The inaugural Women's Prize for Nonfiction. There we go. Welcome to Findmypast Live.
Thank you. Yes, that's the one. No, I mean, it's a bit of a mouthful. The Women's Prize for Nonfiction, the inaugural one. Yeah, there's lots to say.
So it has been an especially busy time for you in the last few weeks and months with your role as chair of the judges for the new Women's Prize for Fiction, Nonfiction, which Findmypast, we're absolutely delighted to be sponsoring. Could you tell us a little about the Women's Prize for Nonfiction and just why it is so important and needed?
So, you know, the Women's Prize for Fiction has been running for nearly 30 years, and we sort of can't imagine the literary landscape without it. But there was a time when it was absolutely needed, and the people at the Women's Prize figured out that a non-fiction prize was needed now. And when they announced that they were going to do this about a year ago, they published some research that they had done, which showed that in 2022, the previous year at that point, a quarter of the space that was in national newspapers reviewing non-fiction books was books by women. A third of the books recommended in the best books of the year were by women in the non-fiction books. Over the previous 10 years across 7 non-fiction prizes, again, about a third of those shortlisted who won were by women. And women's advances, i.e. what authors get paid, were going down by comparison to their male counterparts. In fact, the gender pay gap is increasing. So you sort of either have to conclude on the basis of this evidence that women are just not writing books as well as men, or more probably that there's something structural going on. And so the Women's Prize for Nonfiction is designed to change that. And what it's, I suppose, having to do is overturn an old idea that nonfiction is a man's game, and challenge this or correct this thing that's going on, that women are not being recognised for their contributions to nonfiction. So the prize is drawing attention to excellent writing, excellent research, originality and accessibility in nonfiction writing by women, with the hope that it will move that dial.
It's just staggering. We need this prize, and it's just so great that the Women's Trust have put this new nonfiction prize together. And being a historian and a writer yourself, what does it mean to you to be chairing this judging panel?
Well, it's very exciting. I mean, I'd been harping on about the need for it for a few years and talking to Kate Moss about it, but I was part of a zeitgeist in terms of people thinking this was a good idea. It's really important because I know that it means books that would otherwise have sort of sunk without a trace are going to be noticed, and books that are really worth your while. I mean, so we have recently announced the long list, the inaugural long list, and it's full of absolutely brilliant books that are worth your time, and books that are going to enhance your life. And that's the thing, really, I think, is that this isn't just about the authors, it's about the readers getting access to these amazing, unique, original perspectives on whether that's on technology or neuroscience or history, or it's a memoir, investigative journalism, all sorts of things. In each case, these books bring a fantastic perspective, an original perspective, and I just want readers to enjoy the books that I have so enjoyed.
I mean, I can't wait to delve into the long list. There's such an incredible range there. Some books that, I wouldn't have thought about picking up maybe before. My interests are maybe just in history, but there's books there that cover economics. It's just such a fascinating list. And reading all of these books, what was your experience like as chair of the judges, whittling down like so many books to a list of just 16? And how did you cope with all of that reading?
It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of reading for many months. So it's been an amazing experience. I've learned so much reading for the prize because there are so many excellent works, and I'm a writer, so I'm learning about writing as I'm reading. I learned about things that I wouldn't otherwise have known. As you say, I might well pick up a book on art history. I probably might not have picked up a book about murder in the Philippines, or I might not have picked up a book about, I don't know, capitalism or biology, evolution, perhaps. I don't know. And so I've really expanded the range of things I know about. And how do we get to that long list? Well, we took an awful long time to talk about it. Robust discussion. It was all done graciously, but robust discussion. And there's a sort of real spirit at the Women's Prize of positive judging, which was really wonderful. So we were talking about what we loved rather than what we hated. And then you arrive at this amazing list.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall on that judging process. I really, really would. Oh, well, it's so exciting. And what are the next steps for the inaugural Women's Prize for Nonfiction?
Well, the next step is the announcement of the shortlist, which is the 27th of March. And then in June, on the 13th, we announce the winner. Obviously yet to be decided. So we've got some months to whittle it down further. But for the time being, everybody gets their moment in the sun, which is as it should be.
Absolutely. Well, I know what I'm going to be doing in the run up to June, reading all those wonderful books. And I know at Findmypast we are just so proud to be sponsoring this vital prize that shines such a needed spotlight on the work of fantastic women non-fiction writers across the globe. And while we wait for June, in case we need a break from our reading, it's your opportunity at home to listen to Findmypast's fascinating podcast, Step Into the Past, which you of course host, Suzannah. And I think Ellie's already popped a link into the chat, both for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction and also for the podcast. So I do recommend, if you haven't already, having a listen to the podcast, perhaps after we finish up here. Suzannah, could you tell us a little about the Step Into the Past podcast?
Yes. So for a start, I also want to say thank you so much for sponsoring the Women's Prize for Nonfiction. But the Step Into the Past has been really fun to work on. So this is a podcast that looks into family history. And so each time apart from the first episode, which was about me and sort of turning the tables, my family history. But otherwise, each time I meet with a descendant of a family history that has been traced in relationship to a National Trust site. I think that's the easiest way of putting it. And it's been incredibly moving to talk to these descendants and trace both in steps. So as we record, we walk around these areas, these sites, these towns, or these just these individual houses, which are related to their family history. And I tell them about all the fruits of Findmypast's research into that history. And it's always things they don't know. And it's so moving. I mean, people get really emotional hearing about their ancestors and the circumstances in which they lived. And it's been such a privilege to be the person conveying that information to them.
It really is a wonderful series and so moving, as you say. Do you have a particular favourite moment? And it's quite hard probably to whistle that down, but is there anything that sort of stands out to you as a favourite moment or place or discovery that you've come across?
There was a moment when we were up in Cockermouth and I was talking to one of the descendants of the Wordsworths. Though obviously William Wordsworth is the famous person there, but it was a kind of another wing of the family. And we got down to talking about the contributor's grandfather and grandmother. And we were right next to the gravestone of one of her ancestors in the church there. And we talked about how her grandfather, Alistair, had gone to a ball and then there'd been a fatal crash. Had been involved in a fatal crash and his wife had stayed at home. And actually, if I remember it correctly, I think that he was a public school or a school headmaster. And he had a bit of a row with his wife just before he left, which you can totally imagine, can't you? I mean, like, it's the sort of thing that would happen to all of us. And they'd only been together 8 years, but they had children. And it was just a horrific head-on car crash with a bus. And to be talking about that in this site that was so specific to her family history and talking about loss and how her grandmother coped in the aftermath was really very moving indeed.
Incredibly moving. There are really no words to sort of describe that, and to be in that location sort of brings that extra level. It's an incredibly moving story already, but then to be in that churchyard is it definitely worth giving that episode a listen. And just going back to the first episode where we go on a journey with you through your own family history. Was there anything from that particular episode, any of your favourite finds and discoveries about your own family history that you could tell us about?
Well, there was so many actually, and I think perhaps my favourite moment was when I looked on the face of my great-grandparents. And I know about one set of great-grandparents. They have the name Lipscomb and, so it's the patronymical line, and I sort of know about them. But this was another set that I didn't know about. So this is my paternal grandmother's parents. And I have traced I don't know, it just kind of, how can I say, it kind of reoriented me. I've thought, oh, this is the family line I come from. And then to think, hold on a second, these are my great-grandparents as well. And obviously there are more than those two sets as well. But just to look at their faces and see the photographs and hear a bit about them. And I had known nothing. So my grandmother I just didn't really know anything about her family, the rules. And so it was, I don't know, I found that really moving. And I knew that she'd met my grandfather in India in the war, but I didn't know that her father was a dentist and that they had been in India. He was an American, been in India for years, serving there. And anyway, it was utterly fascinating. And I think that's the thing about family history, is that we care about where we come from, and we can empathize with them, and we can sort of feel our way into their stories. Although it was quite interesting because they were holding up some birds they'd been shooting, and I know people do that today. They do it all around where I live, but it's not something I do, and as a vegetarian, it's not something I'm particularly interested in. And so there's an interesting contrast. I mean, there's that sense of both connection, utter connection, and then distance, and that's what I find so fascinating about the past generally, is that they're both really like us and completely different.
Completely, and that sense of origin, it's where we come from. Without them we wouldn't be here, but we're not the same at the same time. So yeah, just so fascinating. And the power of photographs as well, especially if you haven't known that much about an ancestor or a relative, to see their faces. I've got a few family photos from the past, and it's just so wonderful to be able to connect with your ancestors in that way. And do you have an ancestor that you feel particularly connected to? And if you do, why do you think that might be?
Actually, I suppose I have a picture just sitting just in the background over here of Dorothy, who was the great-grandmother that I knew about, though of course never met. She died 8 years before I was born. And so I feel quite connected to her because I've got sort of family stories about her. But then also in the research I've done, into my own family, her it's her mother was a great sort of founder of a women's cooperative in Gainsborough where she lived, and seems to have been really involved in kind of promoting education for girls, and brought her girls up to be learned and play instruments and this sort of thing, and be quite fiercely independent. And so I have a sense of connection both to those two generations, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother. And if I could go back in time, I'd probably whisk back to about, I don't know, 1885 or something. I mean, obviously I'd like to go back to the 16th century, but otherwise I'd like to go back to about 1885 and pop up to Gainsborough and meet them all.
Oh, so wonderful. Yeah, I think we often ponder here on Find My Past Fridays live about that time machine and where we would go. So it's interesting to know your destinations. And some good news, the Step Into the Past podcast will be coming back soon, I believe, for a second series. Are you able to give us a flavour at all of that upcoming series?
Well, I'll tell you about one that we've recorded already, which is in Birmingham, and it's looking into a family history that's related to the back-to-backs. And so it's incredible because, of course, the National Trust have got those back-to-back houses that you can go and visit. And what I really loved about this one is that it's really dealing with ordinary people's lives in the nicest possible way, just like nobody, not wealthy, showy people in any way, but the sort of people who get lost so often in the historical records are found in this episode, and that's really exciting.
Oh, so exciting! I'm really looking forward to listening to that. I've got a few Birmingham ancestors from the Small Heath region, so it is so wonderful to be able to shine a light on those lives, those working class lives. So we'll definitely keep an eye out for the new series of Step Into the Past. So with all of these wonderful stories that we encounter as family historians, do you have any hints or tips for getting this research down on paper? I'm sure there are many of us out there who would like to one day turn our family stories maybe into a non-fiction book.
So when it comes to writing, I think that there are 3 things to bear in mind. The first is the structure. So you don't want to just say everything that you know about your family. Sometimes when we set out to these things, we just get to kind of like a splurge. And that's fine if you need to get that out of your system, but that's not the book. That's just the splurge. That's draft 1. I don't know if you're allowed to swear on this, but there's a wonderful writer called Anne Lamott who talks about shitty first drafts. And as a writer, you have to have shitty first drafts. And they're the getting it down draft, and then the next draft is the sprucing it up draft. So anyway, so getting it down is important, but I think structure is really important as well. So thinking about when the story begins and when it ends. So it's creating that narrative arc. So that's the difference between just having an informational document that contains all the facts and telling a story, or writing a book, which has, even a non-fiction book is a story to an extent, because it is, because you've got to start and stop somewhere that's satisfying. So it's choosing the bookends and what the structure is in between. And then language, I think Politics in the English Language by George Orwell remains a really good essay for thinking about how you write these things. Sometimes I think when we go to write something like nonfiction, we think that we have to really elevate our prose. And I'm not suggesting, you write it in slang particularly, unless that's what you want to. But I think that simple language is always best. Short sentences, cut out the adverbs, use the word use rather than utilize. You know what I mean? I'm trying to say, like, you don't have to unnecessarily elevate your diction. You just need to use language that communicates. And then the final thing is about evidence. So be guided by the evidence that you have and say what it says. And you can ask questions around that, and you can raise possibilities, but don't run ahead of the evidence. Don't conclude things that you want to be true if the evidence doesn't prove that.
I needed to be writing notes on this. I'm going to have to come back and listen. These are wonderful top tips. And I know a lot of us have an interest in particularly researching women's stories from our family histories, and not just focusing on that male line. What are the difficulties, though, with that kind of research? And do you have any tips for overcoming those challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with women in family histories is that they can quite often appear in family trees as people who give birth to sons and then die. So you've got their birth, the marriage, the children they have, and then their death. And it's about trying to flesh out that picture, really. So it depends on what era you're working on, but there are always sources to draw on. It might be that your ancestor has escaped the limelight of the historical record, but if you go back to the 19th century, say, local newspapers are fantastically useful because they talk about all manner of things. And so I found a lot of people in those, giving a concert somewhere, or they're raising money for this, or they're doing whatever, that you get a kind of a bit of a picture of them. You get something of them. And as you go further back in time, there are different sources. I'd say, generally speaking, the challenge, though, is this: if your ancestor was not aristocratic or royal, which let's face it, is most of us. I mean, until you go back to, say, the 15th century, in which case most of us have got royal blood from them. But if if we're talking about the last few centuries, then I think Michel Foucault put it like this: that unless for an ordinary woman to appear at the historical archives, power has to have marked her with its claw. So she's probably got to have got into some difficult situation, or been accused of a crime, or being challenged in some way under the law, for example, to appear before an authority that's going to write down what she says. Now, that changes as women get more literate, and perhaps we get into the possibility of what we call ego literature, so letters and diaries and all that sort of stuff. But a lot of the time you're trying to find them through other people's words. And so that's the challenge. But I mean, Findmypast has got an extraordinary range of places to look and to start that journey. And then, if you could really get into it, you can supplement that by going to local archives.
Oh, well, absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned newspapers, because that's my speciality. And our community will know that I can't do a live without mentioning newspapers. So I know, like yourself, I've made some wonderful finds. Just my ancestors were very ordinary people. Women in my family appear mostly to do with crime, I will have to say, in the 19th century, stealing shoes and that sort of thing. So absolutely. And I mean,
and then it's worth thinking about, sorry to interrupt you, but it's worth thinking about what that means. Like, so if somebody's stolen shoes, I guess that's the other thing I could say about writing about it is, you say you've got that moment, they're caught. but why? Like, what's their circumstances? And then you can contextualize, did it happen in the 1840s, the hungry 40s, as they're called, when industrialization was really starting to bite? And you can do sort of analogous things by reading about other people's experience, or what we know better testified about people, what we know about them, and therefore you can kind of think yourselves into the possibility of that ancestor and why she had to steal the shoes.
And you're bang on there. It was actually the 1840s when she stole those shoes. So there we go. There's some wonderful stories to be told. And if you were to write a non-fiction book on one of your female ancestors, who do you think you might choose to write about?
Well, I actually really want to do that. So it's a sort of a hope for a future book, is to write about the Robinsons. So the great grandmother I told you about, Dorothy, her three sisters, there's three sisters who lived to adulthood, were amazing women, and none of them married, which mean that they don't have any ancestors who have kept their story going. And so my great aunt always used to talk about them as the aunts, because they essentially raised my grandfather and his sisters, because my great grandparents were overseas. And so I've always grown up with the stories of the aunts. And one of them was a concert violinist. So she played before Liszt in his old age, for example. Another one was an actress, and she traveled to South Africa with her acting. The other one was first a teacher. She was a governess in Burma, and then she was a sort of travel writer. I've got an amazing journal for her, and then she set up a school. And so their story fascinates me, but I'm just working out that story arc that I just talked about. In fact, I'm writing another book now, but when I come to it, that's exactly what I'm figuring out, is what I'm telling.
Oh, amazing. Well, we'll look forward to that one. And this, I suppose, leads us really nicely onto our question of the week. So, Suzannah, every week here on Findmypast Live, we ask our community a question of the week. So this one has been, which female ancestor would you most like to meet and why? And would it be one of the aunts that would you like to meet, or somebody else?
Well, yes, as I say, I mean, if I could meet them all in one go, that would be perfect. But otherwise, I think it would be their mother, who was called Emma, who I think is the one who created that community among her girls, really.
Yeah, such a legacy of strong women there. So I'm just going to have a little look at some of the answers that have been coming through from our lovely community. And we've got another person here who would like to go back to the 1500s. So someone after your,
well, yes. I mean, obviously, I would love to go back to the 1530s, really. 1520s, 1530s. Happy to stay for a few years, as long as you bring me back.
Yeah. So we've got Matthew here. He'd like to meet any of his female ancestors from back then. And his earliest female ancestor was born roughly in the 1470s. Wow, that is remarkable that Matthew's managed to trace his family back that far.
Definitely the earliest female ancestor that you know about, Matthew.
Yes.
So we definitely... There was some before.
To clarify, yes, absolutely.
I'm very excited to get back to the 1470s.
Definitely, yes. That is remarkable. And we've got an interesting answer here from Ellen. So she would like to meet her brick wall-fed great-grandmother, who saw 7 out of her 10 children die young, lost her first husband, swindled out of an inheritance, and yet her life before her marriage is unknown. We'd love to sit down and find out her maiden name and how she managed to carry on. She sounds like quite a woman, and we've been talking about our strong female ancestors, and Ellen's third great grandmother definitely sounds like one of these strong women.
Yes, Ellen. I'd say Emma, the one I was talking about. We've got the aunts who survived. There were 4 children who didn't, and who all died at different times of scarlet fever, which today, of course, is treatable by antibiotics. And how did they do that? How did she deal? How did your 3 times great grandmother deal with 7 of her children dying young? And don't let anyone tell you that because infant mortality or child mortality was more common, they were inured to it. It's just rubbish. The evidence doesn't uphold that at all. They lived with this extraordinary pain.
Yeah, again, there's so many instances, certainly in my family trees and others, of parents naming their lost children, their surviving children after children that they've lost. So Rosina is a very important name in my family because of that. Let's just see what other. I've got some great answers coming through. I'll just pick a few more. We're going back in time here, not quite to the 15th century though, with Hayley and female ancestors. It's really hard to narrow it down to just one. She'd love to have a panel discussion, which I think is a great idea. Why not limit it to just the one? With all my great grandmothers who immigrated in the 16th and 17th century from Holland and England to the New World, I would love to ask about the motivations for setting out into the unknown and to know about their lives in colonial America.
And what you can do, meanwhile, Hayley, is read about what we do know about people in colonial America. So I don't know, I'm thinking of works like John Demos, they're all the shelves behind me, is a wonderful place to start. Or there was a great work that I recently read about witchcraft in North America, and so you get a real insight into the culture of the 17th century and what it was like for colonialists. I'll just find that book whilst you read the next one.
Oh, amazing! Top tips from Suzannah and reading tips. This is wonderful. So I'll just find one more.
So this is the one I want to tell you about. It's called The Possession of Barbe Allais. It's about diabolical arts and daily life in early Canada. Anyway, I found it really interesting because it thinks a lot about the colonial experience. That's the one I was thinking of.
Okay, I might need to order that after we finish up here. It's such a fascinating period. I don't have any ancestors who emigrated, but I do just love finding out about that time, and fascinating. There's so many good answers coming through. It is hard to pick. This one from Kim. I'd like to meet my great-grandmother, Kathleen Hanson. She was a match girl at Bryant and May in 1888 and still there in 1901.
Oh my goodness, the life of the match girls. Gosh, I mean, the sort of we did a program years ago called Hidden Killers of the Edwardian Home, and but one of the things we talked about was match girls, and the circumstances in which sorry, I just had a cat jump past me. Circumstances in which they worked and the damage it did to them, and radiation, all that. It was extraordinary.
Oh, and I think 1888 that the match girls strike is ringing a bell for that year. Possibly as well. So a very interesting point there in industrial and women's history. So if we've got time, we might come back to some of these answers. They've been fantastic. Yes, if you do have any questions out there, those who are watching for Suzannah, do feel free to ask them. And I think we've got one from Eleanor. Any tips on writing historical fiction books or university essay? Broad range there.
Yes. Okay. Lots of tips on university essays, because I've taught lots of students to write those, which is you should have an introduction that really tells the reader what you're planning to do, that the first line of each paragraph should say what you're going to say, the last line of each paragraph should connect that point to the next one at the beginning of and the middle of the paragraph should be the facts that prove the line at the beginning that is your argument. Historical fiction. No, I haven't written any historical fiction yet. I don't know if I will, but what I suspect is that you do all the research that you do for historical fact, and then you put it all aside and you use your imagination. I mean, as non-fiction writers, we use our imaginations, but when you're writing fiction, you're allowed to take a little bit more of a leap, I think. So I think do the research is the answer. Get yourself into the period, know it thoroughly, know what their shoes felt like and what floors they were walking on and how it felt when they moved in those clothes, but also know the things they would fundamentally believe that are utterly different to the things we believe. Because what the worst thing you can do when writing historical fiction, at least I think the worst crime that historical novelists commit, is to put 21st century people back into the 1520s, say, and then have them act as if they would, as if they're sort of women or men of this period. I find that really irritating. So it's about getting into their mentality as much as their physicality.
Yeah, no, it is such a challenge. I'm just laughing because there's a comment here saying, please don't write historical fiction.
Yeah. Well, do you think I'd be terrible at it? Anyway, no, I've got lots of non-fiction that I'm working on at the moment. So
yeah, and you did have a brief appearance from the cat. Mark,
yes, the cat's just sitting next to me meowing, so I thought you might be able to hear, and so I thought I just picked.
I think I did
at least see.
Oh, hello. What is your cat's name?
This is Malfi, like the Duchess of Malfi. Although actually the Duchess turns out to be a duke, but we didn't know that.
Gorgeous. Lovely. And question here from another Rose. He says, hi, Suzannah. I know you've been working on Henry's Wives. I've been wondering for ages if you've seen the musical Six.
Well, of course I have. I mean, it literally counts as research, doesn't it? Yeah, no, of course I have. And I spoke to the writers of it for my other podcast, not just the Tudors. So yes, of course I've seen it. And I am working on Henry VIII's Queens slowly but steadily. Lots and lots of new cool things to share with you in due course.
Amazing. And can you give us a flavour of anything that you're working? I know you're very busy, but can you give us a flavour of anything else that's coming up for you?
Well, as I say, mostly at the moment, it's writing my book, doing my podcasts. There are some TV possibilities, but we won't know for a couple of months if that. So, but having said that, there's also, I do lots of stuff for History Hit in terms of films. And so the next film I'm making with them, which is actually next week, is about the exhibition on Holbein. That is happening at the Buckingham Palace at the moment. So that's fun. I went and spoke to them about it for a podcast, but I'm going to go back and film because these are the faces, the drawings, the sketches of Henry VIII's court. And so what we were talking about, photographs and seeing these people face to face, it's like that when you look at these people, but they're from the 1530s, and it's amazing. And here's one really interesting thing about it. There's a sketch by Holbein that historians for quite a while now have said, although it's labelled Anne Boleyn, it was labelled Anne Boleyn in the 18th century, it's not her, right? They've said it's not her, she's wearing the dress, the things that she's wearing, it's not appropriate, she doesn't look like, her other depictions, because there is no surviving portrait of her from her lifetime. And what is fascinating is that I went and talked to Kate Hurd, who's the curator there, and I talked to Elizabeth Goldring, who is writing a biography of Holbein, and we all thought it was Anne, and we all had different evidence for concluding so. You put all this evidence together, and it's almost certain. I think we are looking at Anne Boleyn's face when we look at that sketch. And the fact that all three of us had reached this conclusion, but on the basis of different evidence, meant that you put them together and it becomes a pretty watertight argument.
I think I've actually got goosebumps. That is so exciting. So I can't wait
her from the life portrait, her ad vivem portrait. How exciting. Anyway.
Wow. Yeah. I grew up when I was very young. Well, still even just on a diet of the Tudors and Anne Boleyn. So it's just incredible to think that that's her face. It's amazing. So I think we've got a few more questions coming through. Jade has a question. Have you researched your family into the 16th century, Suzannah?
I've only researched it back to the 17th century, and I say it's actually not. It's not me at all. So my family. So when I inherit, I've got my family archives, as it were, as such as they count, because everyone thinks I'm a historian. I'm a safe pair of hands, and there are family trees in there. So I think it was my great-grandfather who was particularly interested in tracing them back, and he managed to get back to a Richard Lipscomb in the 17th century who drowned in Portsmouth Harbour. And there's actually a portrait of him, which I discovered that, someone else, because of course, as you go back, it kind of narrows, and so there's lots of us and not so many of them. So somebody else who was researching this had found this portrait. But he's one of, like, by that stage, he's like one of 256 or whatever it is ancestors that I have back then. So it's really interesting to try and do that, and I think I would like to push it back further, but I think it's so easy, as I was saying earlier, to get sort of stuck on following your own surname back into history, which means you follow the men. And actually, there are so many routes for us to investigate. Which one do we take? So I think we have to try all sorts of different ancestors and following their lines back to see where we find the most interesting stuff.
Oh, definitely. And on the theme of Lipscombs, Matthew asks, do you know where the Lipscomb name comes from?
Yes, it's Lipscomb with a P. We're like lips and comb, and no E, but what you've just typed, Matthew, is exactly what happens to me all the time. So please don't feel bad about it. So apparently it's from it's Norman French. This is like family law rather than me absolutely being certain, and it's something to do with de la Combe or like the lip of a hill or something like that, but I feel like I might be conflating two things, but that's what I sort of vaguely have in my head from being told.
We did see some support for potential foray into historical fiction there for you, Suzannah.
Thanks, Jan.
Adores it when historians add the colour of fiction there.
But it looks like Jan knows. Is it Jan or Jan knows what they're talking about? Because that looks like I can see a title there, a cover of a book.
Amazing. Okay. I didn't actually think we'd have time for a little look at our new records of the week, but we do have some records that we've added to Find My Past this week that were actually quite useful in adding some more colour and context to stories about our female ancestors. So I'm just going to bring this up for us to have a little look at, Suzannah. We have added this week, we've added new transcription fields to the 1871 census for England and Wales. So we've added fields of occupation and the place of birth. So you can now search the 1871 census by both of these new fields. So really useful for narrowing down your search, locating those problem ancestors and breaking down those brick walls. And importantly, we can now search for women by their occupation. So we did a little search for a kind of familiar occupation here. So I'd love to show this to you. And apologies if it is a little small there. So the woman in question here we're looking at is Elizabeth N. Cooper. So can you see that there?
We've got historian. Isn't that fantastic that she's named as a historian, 40 years old? I see you, Elizabeth. I see you.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
I wonder what that was like, what her experience was, what she was researching. Just fascinating. So she's in London, she's living in London, and sadly she passes away just a couple of years later. But really wonderful to have her record here as a historian in that particular census. We've got found another quite unusual one, and this is quite small again, so apologies. So this is the record for a Caroline A. Smedley, and she's working as a hydropathist, so a precursor of hydrotherapy. So treating sort of disorders, ailments with water, and she's living in a rather nice place called Ryber Castle, and with her husband, who has an occupation of a manufacturer and hydropathist too. So we've got a husband and wife duo working alongside each other. What do you make of this particular record, Suzanne? It's quite an unusual one.
I don't think I've ever come across hydropathy. know exactly what it is. But what's interesting about that there is that clearly the man and wife are working together, and I wonder if it says he's the manufacturer. Lots of women who worked in swimming baths, Margaret says, called themselves hydrotherapists. That's really interesting. So I wonder if he says manufacturer. So is he doing that? Before I knew that, I was thinking perhaps he's a sort of founder of the business, and then she also works in it. And that would be my first go-to thought. Quite often, before we have census records, we see a man named as something, but actually often the woman is doing it alongside him. So that would be fast. I want to know more.
Yes, no, absolutely. And Sarah has provided a link to Elizabeth Cooper, our historian. So that is definitely going to have a look at that after the session today to learn some more about her. And with these additions that we've made over the last week, so if you now search for female and writer in your search criteria for the 1871 census, you will now find 59 results. So there are 59 women out there in the 1871 census identifying themselves as writers. Just fascinating.
So two things that have just come up in the Janet Scarra says Buxton and maybe Matlock had hydrotherapy establishments, and this is of course the time when taking the waters is seen to be something that you can do to cure yourself of various diseases. So it might be something like that. And then Elizabeth Cooper is I've just had a look, just quickly gone onto Wikipedia, and she wrote about Lady Arbella Stewart. So here we go. Actually we even have topics in common.
Oh, how amazing. We love that. Now, on slightly different tack, we've also updated and added new records to our crime, prison and punishment set. So we've got a huge crime database, and this is, we've got over 3 million records, and this is in partnership with the National Archives. So we have added just over 62,000 brand new records to this set. And I think we touched on this slightly earlier with the example of my ancestor stealing shoes, that crime records can be a really useful tool in researching our women ancestors. So, as we were saying, the need to survive poverty may have often led them into a life of crime. Suzannah, do you have any criminal ancestors that you know of?
Well, we have we have a Mary Lipscomb. I can see it. So I don't know if she's a relation or not. That's fascinating.
We're not sure. So yeah, we picked her out. So this record actually goes back to 1838.
Wow.
And this Mary Lipscomb has been found guilty of stealing 7 sheets, 8 curtains, 1 quilt and 3 nightgowns, which were the property of John Jones, and other goods belonging to David Lloyd Jones, alongside another woman, Sarah Pithers.
Okay, so that's not an opportunistic crime, is it? It's a crime that maybe that she's been working with. Sounds like my guess is going to be that she's been working for him and then has taken some stuff and then he's prosecuting her. Maybe she's been a governess or a servant of some sort.
Yeah, and she was found guilty. She got 6 months. So yeah.
Well, that's because the law works in favor of capital, right? So
yeah. We go. And we've got this other one here. So this week's updates. So we've added to a particular set. It's called Crim 9, and they're records from the Central Criminal Court. So these are basically after trial calendars of prisoners. So they list the trial details of prisoners. So the alleged crime, the outcome of the trial, and the sentence, if appropriate. So we've added records to this set from the years 1915 to 1925. We've got over 62,000 brand new records here. And this is just one of them that caught my eye. It's from 1918, and it's the record of Dorothy Lillian Elizabeth Blundell. She's 28, and I admit it caught my eye because she describes herself as an artiste. And the crime that she's accused of is marrying Edwin Charles Perry, her husband then being alive. We do see, and what I noticed looking through these records about women's cases who came up to these trials, there's a lot of alleged bigamy cases. Suzannah, any idea why this might be?
Well, yes, but it's because they don't have the same freedom of relationships that we have today. So it's much harder to get a divorce, and it's very hard, particularly hard if you're the woman trying to initiate it. It's easier for men somewhat. And actually, you know, this is just about moving on, right? So a relationship breaks up today, and you may have got married or you may not have done in the first place anyway. And divorce is much easier than it used to be. But if you haven't got married, then you can just go and have a relationship with somebody else, and no one's going to be criticizing you for it. But in the past, there wasn't that freedom of action because you were just trapped, right? You marry somebody, and then there's very, very, especially for a woman, very difficult to get out of it. So even if her marriage had broken down with her first husband and she wanted to form another relationship, you know, then I can think you can see charges of bigamy, and perhaps she wants to be respectable, so she marries the next chap, but just hasn't actually divorced the first, although she's found not guilty, so I might be completely maligning Dorothy.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. This is Dorothy's found not guilty, and I found a newspaper clipping about the case. So she's a musical artist, and the alleged bigamous marriage takes place in 1911. So the trial record is from 1918. So there's some time that's elapsed. So how this charge came about? So she's stopped on the street by a policeman who seems to know her. He tells her that he was going to arrest her for bigamy and that she wouldn't be able to get away with it. And I quote, because she is a very well-known person and could always be found. And in my mind, it kind of sounds like this policeman's got a bit of a vendetta against Dorothy. It's an interesting.
Well, it's also she's obviously famous in the area as a musical artist, and it reminds me. There's an amazing book by Saidiya Hartman, which is called "Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments," and it's talking about women in North American cities in the 1880s to 1920s, and it's particularly focusing on Black women and the way in which they were often arrested and put into institutions for reformation, but they're essentially prisons. If they were found out later, if they were suspected of falling into moral depravity, so they don't even have to have done something wrong. So if they're out late at night, getting back late from work, for example, or if they're out dancing, or if they have a relationship with someone they're not, a sexual relationship with someone they're not married to. But they don't even have to have done that. They could just be suspected of possibly going down that route sometime to be incarcerated. And so Professor Hartman looks at all this evidence and thinks about the way in which so much of the factual evidence, the archive that we have, is not fact. It's full of lies about people. And, and maybe this is an example too.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. That just complete gender injustice over the years. And just moving on to our final set, which is the Teachers Registration Council registers. So from criminals to teachers here, and we've added extra transcription fields to this really interesting set, as well as some new records. So you can see now the name of a teaching college where an individual attended, and this set includes the names of some of the earliest registered female teachers. So there's over 61,000 women in this set in all, and it's such an important collection, I think, because teaching was one of the sort of early career paths for women, I suppose. Suzannah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, you've got another Lipscomb. This is amazing. So I'm a Professor Emerita at the University of Roehampton, and that was one of the first places that women could go to train from the 1840s. Wow. I mean, before you could get women could get degrees at Oxford or Cambridge, they could go and train at the teacher training college there, because it was exactly the sort of thing that a woman could do and make a profession of. And I mentioned Ethel, who was one of my ancestors, who was a teacher. And apparently possibly Emily as well. So I think it's absolutely fascinating to see women stepping out into the professional world. And this is one of the places we're going to be finding them. And they're probably quite often going to be single women. because it's much harder to maintain a career. It's, in fact, in most cases, it was impossible once you were married.
And I'd just love to show you, this is the original record that goes alongside the transcription. So you can click through on the site to see the original record. So this is for Emily Elsie Lipscomb. I'm, again, not sure if it is a relative. So there's some fascinating details there. Is there anything you want to highlight from this particular piece? I know, again, it's quite small there.
Yes, this is like doing a sight reading test. Let me see. I'm going to show you this to make some historical conclusions. So, I mean, obviously we've got the fact that she's from Southeast London, though she seems to be practicing over in West London. It becomes a headmistress. So it'd be fascinating to know if those schools that she was teaching at in Bromley and then Old Kent Road, Paddington, whether they were girls' schools. I imagine so, but it would be great to know more about that. And, this is quite a long time that she's doing that as well. She's got almost a 30-year career there. It's just fascinating.
It really...
Andrew Alston tells us just researching a teacher who continued after marriage. So there are some exceptions to what I've just said, but and that's interesting in itself, because it may be that it's only really, in the 50s or 40s or 50s that there is a swing. Maybe actually then it becomes impossible to work after marriage. But actually, if we look at earlier periods, it's not so much. We always think that history is kind of progressive, and actually time is not like that, really.
No, not at all. And one of the small thing I noticed about this particular record is that the school that she's teaching at, the last school that she's at in 1929, is Essendine Road in Paddington, and that really rung a bell for me. So when I first moved to London, I lived in Maida Vale, and Essendine Road School was where I voted in 2016. So that was a very small world moment. And yeah, just finally. This is a record for May Christophera. I'm not quite sure, but she's a Staveley, not one of my Staveleys. But she was a woman after your own heart, Suzannah. She had an incredible career. So she's got qualifications in history from the University of Oxford, MAs from Dublin and Bristol. So she seems like she's a real trailblazer in the academic field. So even, I think, gosh, it is small, but I think that's 1899 that she's working at the University of Birmingham as a lecturer and a warden. She works at the University of Liverpool and then ends up in Bristol. It's an incredible record to see this sort of trailblazing women in the academic field.
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, well done. That's great.
Well, thank you so much. I think let me just.
Well, we've had a real sense from what you've brought up. I mean, we in criminal records, teachers' registers, the range of sources that we can go to find women in is expanding, and it's just such an amazing resource to Findmypast in terms of being able to do that. What I think so interesting about it is that historical research can feel quite lonely, but here you've got this amazing community and you've got all of these resources, and you can do it. It's just so accessible. You can do it from your own home, and I think that's incredible.
We really are so lucky, and we've been so lucky to have you with us here today, Suzannah. I think we can all say that we've learned so much. There's so much to read, there's so much to listen to, there's so much to watch, and so much to look forward to. So it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you. And another animal joining me. 1 second. Goodness me, it's the time they should be fed, you see, so they're all joining. There's actually one more thing, if you don't mind me mentioning. When you were asking what I've got coming up, I'm starting quite soon, and we've been talking about women today, but I'm starting quite soon an online course about Henry VIII. So if anyone's interested in that, do pop along to my website and you can sign up, and I'll let you know more about it in due course.
Oh, perfect. And Ellie's popped a link into the chat there, so if you're interested,
thanks, Ellie.
Do have a look. So just a big thank you again to you, Suzannah. Thank you everyone today for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Rose.